Hi there, and welcome to MiWeek. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Christy McDonald. The recent attack on a federal judge has placed the spotlight on crime in Detroit once again. Judge Terrance Berg wasn't shot because he was a judge. He was just another unfortunate victim of violence. The judge's family has urged the community not to blame Detroit for the shooting. So coming up, we will look at the fight against crime in the city. What has to change to make the streets safer? Plus, the new head of the DEGC talks about the best ways to sell Detroit to investors. Also, another longtime member of Michigan's congressional delegation is calling it quits. We're going to take a look at Candace Miller's impact on Capitol Hill. And Governor Snyder could make some big changes that would impact the Education Achievement Authority. It is all coming up for you on MiWeek. But we do start with the story that has the entire city and region talking. U.S. District Judge Terrance Berg was shot in the leg last week on his own front porch in northwest Detroit after he refused to let two young men enter his house. The judge is recovering after surgery, and the search continues for the two attackers. Meanwhile, the residents in the area packed a community meeting led by Detroit Police Chief James Craig this week to ask what can be done to keep the neighborhood safe. And that's where we begin our discussion with our MiWeek contributors Nolan Finley of the Detroit News and Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. Gentlemen, it's good to see you. When you heard the news of Judge Berg being shot, Nolan, what went through your mind?
Well, I mean, it's more newsworthy because he's a federal judge, but this isn't an unusual occurrence. There were 300 murders in the city last year, which was just shy of what New York City, a place that's, what, 10, 12 times as large as Detroit, they had about the same number of murders. We've got a culture of violence in this city that we have to get at. We have to deal with somehow. Too many guns in too many pockets of too many people who just don't care. And I think you could put a cop on every corner and not solve that problem. We've got to get at the bigger issue of why folks are so trigger happy here.
And why do you think that is?
I couldn't say, but I do think we've had sort of a lawless attitude in Detroit for so long that it's just become part of the mindset.
The police chief is working to change that, though, and reaching out to the community in a lot of various ways. But you still have community meetings this week where people are terribly concerned about maybe the random nature of what this crime was.
Yeah, well, and that's the that's the thing that scares people. It's that, you know, you can be in a relatively stable part of the city, which is where Judge Berg lives, going inside your house and two people come up on you and try to rob you. That's the kind of crime that you can't afford in a city that's claiming to be coming back, and this sort of exposes that gap between the narrative we're trying to craft about Detroit right now and the reality. That a lot of the things that we were trying to do and a lot of the efforts that are being made, particularly around crime, are working, but they are working in ways that are not going to be all that obvious to people who live here quite yet. Crime is down, but it is not down as significantly as it should be, and it is not down in neighborhoods like University District, which are very stable and still middle class, but are surrounded by much more desperate areas.
How impactful do you think it was, Nolan, that the family came out and said, "Don't blame Detroit for this"?
I think it was a nice gesture and a signal of their commitment. I don't think it has any impact at all. What people see is that, as Steve said, in one of our better neighborhoods, you're still not as safe as you might expect to be. And that does affect the mindset, not only the people who are living there and perhaps on the bubble, but folks who might say, well, you know, maybe we'll venture away from downtown in considering housing and looking at some of the neighborhoods, which is where you need this thing to go. And I think it has an impact. So
how do you measure, I guess, success in the city? Because obviously you're not going to eradicate crime completely, and you've got to give James Craig some time to work things out. But Stephen, is there a time limit where you say, okay, this isn't working or this is working for the police chief?
It is working. It's just you're not going to take a city that had almost 400 murders a couple years ago and get it down to 200 or 100 in a year or two. I mean, it takes time, and crime is driven by a lot of things that the police chief has no control over. I mean, the desperate poverty and isolation that people feel in the city, the lack of opportunity, which we are still not really addressing. All of these things feed into the cycles of crime. And that's not to say that all poor people become criminals. Of course not. But poverty is an accelerator for crime. And so until you start really shifting the focus to dealing with some of those things, you're not going to get but so far. I do think we'll get to a place where neighborhoods like University District are relatively safe like they are in other cities, but we're not even at that point yet in Detroit.
Real quick, trial run starting very soon with body cameras on 20 officers, Nolan, in the Detroit Police Department. What kind of impact do you think that's going to have?
Well, I think it's an offshoot, of course, of some of the problems you've seen across the nation. I think it'll give the police a little more confidence in their dealings with the public. I mean, there won't be any question about what happens in a counter, and it should give the public a little more confidence, too. I think it's a good move.
All right.